In the late 8th century after Christ, Scandinavian coastal communities faced an impossible equation. The growing season lasted barely 4 months. Winter stretched from October through March, 6 months when nothing grew and stored grain ran low. Families counted the weeks their provisions might last, knowing that by late February, hunger would come regardless of how carefully they rationed. The sea surrounded them cold, dangerous, and full of fish, but reaching those fish during winter storms required innovations that would transform Norse society. The stone-weighted deep line emerged from this desperation. Unlike simple fishing lines that drifted near the surface, these devices used stones weighing up to 20 pounds, carved with grooves and holes to secure thick walrus-hide ropes. Fishermen lowered these lines 300 feet down into fjord depths where cod and halibut congregated during winter. The technique required intimate knowledge of underwater terrain, rocky shelves, deep channels, the slopes where fish gathered. Families guarded this knowledge jealously, passing mental maps from father to son through winter nights of storytelling. A single good deep-line spot could feed a household for months. In the fjords around modern Trondheim, these weighted lines pulled up cod so large that 2 men struggled to lift them into boats. But deep lines only worked where fjords ran deep. Along shallower coasts, fishermen developed night fire fishing, a technique so dangerous that many considered it touched by madness. The method required building a small controlled fire in a sand-filled iron basket mounted on the boat's prow. The firelight, reflecting off the water's surface, attracted fish to the surface in massive numbers. Cod, herring, and mackerel rose toward the light, becoming easy targets for nets and spears. Yet the danger was ever present. A boat rocking in waves, fire sparks landing on tarred ropes or wooden planks, the constant risk of the tossed whole vessel igniting miles from shore. 3 boats from the settlement at Kaupang burned completely in the spring of 816, drowning all 7 fishermen aboard. Still, survivors continued the practice because on successful nights, a single boat might harvest 500 fish, enough to feed 30 people for a week. Winter ice created its own opportunities. When fjords froze solid, fish moved into torpid states below the ice, their movements slowed by cold. The ice spear gaff developed after a fisherman named Thorvald Haraldsson, recorded in later sagas as Thorvald Icebreaker, thrust his broken spear through ice in the winter of 823 to reach a massive halibut he spotted in shallow water. He discovered that the hooked spear design, when jabbed through ice holes, could snag fish too sluggish to escape. Within seasons, every coastal settlement had men drilling holes in ice at dawn, working gaff poles into the water below. The technique worked best in January and February when ice was thick enough to support human weight, but fish had not yet migrated to deeper, warmer waters. During spring and summer, communities turned to permanent installations. Tidal trap weirs represented massive communal investments, stone walls built in crescents along beaches, designed to trap fish when tides receded. Construction required hundreds of people moving boulders, fitting stones without mortar, creating structures that could withstand winter storms yet remain open enough for fish to enter during high tide. The weir at Vik on the Sognefjord, built around 835, stretched 200 feet and required every able-bodied person in the settlement, laboring for 3 weeks. But once complete, it produced predictable harvests twice daily. Children could gather the trapped fish at low-tide flounder, plaice, small cod, providing reliable protein without dangerous boat journeys. These 4 techniques, deep lines, fire, fishing, ice gaffing, and tidal weirs, formed the foundation of Norse fishing mastery. They shared common elements: intimate environmental knowledge, willingness to take calculated risks, and adaptation to extreme conditions that would have defeated less determined peoples. Fishing became as honored as warfare. The best fishermen earned bynames Codbringer, Winter Feeder, Storm Defier, that carried into saga literature. Their knowledge sustained not just families but entire regional populations, creating food surpluses that freed young men for raiding expeditions. The longships that would terrorize European coasts were crewed by men whose families survived because someone perfected fishing techniques in freezing waters. Survival came first, conquest followed. But here is what the records do not tell us. The saga accounts mention these fishing heroes, yet they remain strangely silent on crucial details. How did Thorvald Haraldsson know exactly where to look through the ice? The sagas say he spotted the halibut, but winter ice in Norwegian fjords typically measures a foot thick, opaque, covered in snow. What method allowed him to see through it? Some scholars suggest he watched for subtle differences in ice color, claiming experienced fishermen could detect fish shadows beneath. Others point to unexplained references in later texts about ice sight or winter seeing phrases that appear without elaboration, hinting at techniques the saga writers assumed their audiences already understood. The night fire fishing presents deeper mysteries. Yes, we know fire attracted fish. Modern experiments confirm this basic principle, but the historical accounts describe something more sophisticated. Fishermen supposedly knew which fish species would rise to different fire intensities, bright flames for mackerel, smouldering coals for cod. They claimed certain moon phases rendered fire fishing useless, others made it irresistible to fish. Orkneyinga saga mentions fishermen who could read the flame dance to predict the size of coming catches. What were they observing? Were these genuine environmental patterns, lost empirical knowledge about fish behavior under different conditions? Or were they ritualistic beliefs that happened to align with natural cycles? The weirs raise their own questions. Archaeologists have mapped dozens of these structures along Norwegian and Icelandic coasts. Many show identical construction angles, stone placement patterns that repeat across hundreds of miles of coastline. The precision suggests centralized knowledge, perhaps master builders who traveled between settlements sharing techniques. But no historical records mention such specialists. No saga describes weir architects or fishing engineers. The structures simply appear in the archaeological record, already perfected, as if the knowledge arrived fully formed. Some researchers propose an older tradition, pre-Viking methods inherited from peoples who occupied these coasts before Norse settlement. The Sami people, indigenous to northern Scandinavia, practiced sophisticated fishing long before Vikings. Did Norse settlers learn from them, adapting techniques while erasing the cultural origins? The silence in Norse sources about any such knowledge transfer seems conspicuous. Most intriguing are the deep-line fishing spots themselves. Modern fishermen using traditional techniques report finding ancient stone weights still embedded in fjord bottoms, marking locations that remain productive 1,000 years later. How did Viking fishermen originally identify these spots? Trial and error seems insufficient. Fjords are vast, deep, and in winter. Attempting multiple locations risks death from cold and storms. Yet somehow, within generations of settling new territories, Norse communities had mapped the richest fishing grounds with remarkable accuracy. Families passed this knowledge orally, never writing it down, never marking it on any map that survives. When those oral traditions broke, when families died out or moved away, the knowledge vanished, locations forgotten despite being geographically fixed and theoretically rediscoverable. This pattern of lost precision haunts every technique. We have the broad strokes, the basic principles recovered through archaeology and experimental reconstruction, but the fine details, the subtle environmental readings, the accumulated wisdom of generations remain tantalizingly out of reach. The Vikings who perfected these methods were not writing treatises or keeping scientific records. They were feeding their families, and in doing so, they developed expertise that died with them. What we have recovered represents perhaps 20% of what they knew. The rest lies beneath cold waters, embedded in stones whose meaning we can only guess, whispered in place names we translate but do not truly understand. The longships that carried Vikings to England, Ireland, and beyond were possible because someone, generations earlier, had learned to read winter ice, to speak with fire and shadow, to build stone crescents that whispered to tides. These were not simple fishermen. They were environmental masters working at the edge of human survival, developing technologies sophisticated enough to sustain civilization in one of Earth's harshest climates. And most of what they learned is gone, leaving us to wonder, what other knowledge did they possess that we have not even recognized we lost? As Vikings expanded westward, They carried fishing knowledge like seeds to new soil. Iceland, settled beginning in 874, had no agriculture beyond hardy sheep and no forests for building material. Yet within 2 generations it supported tens of thousands of people. Fish made this possible. The cold Icelandic waters teemed with cod, and Norse settlers adapted their techniques to these new conditions, creating innovations that would define the golden age of Viking fishing. The kelp forest funnel net represented genius adaptation to unfamiliar waters. Unlike Norwegian fjords, Iceland's coasts featured vast underwater kelp forests, where fish congregated to feed on small creatures living among the vegetation. A fisherman named Ketil Gothmundsson, Ketil the Netmaker, documented in the Landnámabók settlement records, observed how fish moved through kelp channels in predictable patterns. He designed nets stretched between kelp stands, creating natural funnels that guided fish into waiting traps. The nets themselves were marvels of engineering, woven from seal sinew and sheep wool, treated with pine tar to resist rot, with carefully calculated mesh sizes that let small fish escape while capturing mature specimens. A well-placed kelp funnel net could harvest 200 fish in a single tide change without requiring boats or risky deep-water fishing. Meanwhile, in Norwegian waters, competition for rich herring runs created the next major innovation. Herring migrated along Scandinavian coasts in massive schools so dense that their bodies darkened the water. Different settlements claimed traditional fishing grounds, and conflicts erupted regularly. In approximately 920, near the modern city of Bergen, Norwegian and Danish fishing fleets clashed over a particularly rich herring run. The violence lasted 3 days, with men fighting on beaches and in shallow waters, before jarls negotiated a truce. But the conflict sparked innovation, the barrel-weighted purse seine. This technique revolutionized fishing. Fishermen attached wooden barrels to weighted nets that hung vertically in the water. When a herring school passed, boats quickly encircled it, the net forming a wall. Then fishermen dove underwater, pulling drawstrings that closed the net bottom like a purse, trapping entire schools. The barrels kept the net's top at the surface while preventing it from sinking too deep. A single, successful purse seine operation could harvest 10,000 herring more fish than traditional methods caught in a week. The technique required coordination between 3 boats, 6 experienced fishermen, and swimmers brave enough to dive in cold water to close the net. But the rewards were extraordinary. The wealth from purse seining created fishing dynasties. Families like the Erlingssons of Hordaland and the Sigurðarsinir of Western Iceland accumulated fortunes rivaling military chieftains. They could afford to outfit multiple boats, hire crews, and control prime fishing grounds. Their dried fish became currency throughout Scandinavia and beyond. A cargo of dried cod from Bergen could be traded in Dublin for silver, in York for woolen cloth, in Hedeby for weapons and tools. Fish transformed from subsistence food into a commercial commodity that flowed through Viking trade networks from Greenland to Constantinople. This commercial expansion drove the final major innovation, the bone hook long line. While earlier fishing used single hooks or small numbers of baited lines, the long line system represented a scaling breakthrough. Fishermen carved hundreds of hooks from whalebone and walrus ivory materials that did not rust and could be sharpened repeatedly. They attached these hooks at 6-foot intervals along lines that stretched up to 2 miles. Setting a long line required a full day, sailing to deep water, carefully lowering the baited line using small stone weights every 100 feet to keep it at the right depth, marking the line's position with floating sealskin buoys. The next morning, crews returned to haul the line, back-breaking work, pulling thousands of feet of rope hand over hand. But a single long line could harvest 300 fish, cod, halibut, even the occasional massive Greenland shark. Long-line fishing required substantial capital investment, a complete outfit, the main line, hundreds of hooks, weights, buoys, specialized boats, large enough for deep-water work, cost as much as a small farm. Only wealthy families or cooperative partnerships could afford it, but those who could dominated fishing grounds. By 990, long-line fleets from Iceland and Norway controlled the richest cod banks from Newfoundland to the Faroe Islands. 3 more specialized techniques completed the fishing arsenal. Kelp smoke preservation transformed seasonal abundance into year-round supply. After the harsh winter of 976, remembered in Icelandic chronicles as the Wolf Winter, when livestock died in massive numbers, desperate settlers discovered that smoking fish over burning kelp produced superior preservation. The kelp smoke contained natural salts and compounds that prevented spoilage far better than wood smoke. Fish treated this way lasted months without refrigeration and developed a distinctive, prized flavor. By 1000 after Christ, Iceland exported kelp-smoked fish throughout the Norse world, commanding premium prices. These 7 techniques, stone-weighted deep lines, night fire fishing, ice spear gaffing, tidal trap weirs, kelp funnel nets, barrel-weighted purse seines, and bone-hook long lines represented the technological peak of Viking fishing mastery. They sustained populations from Greenland to Vinland, generated wealth that financed raids and settlements, and created a fishing culture sophisticated enough to compete with any maritime society on Earth. The period from 850 to 1000 after Christ marked the Golden Century, when Norse fishermen were unmatched masters of northern seas. But the conditions enabling their dominance were already shifting. But here is what troubles historians. The Landnámabók describes Ketil Guðmundsson inventing kelp funnel nets, yet archaeological evidence suggests the technique appeared simultaneously across multiple Icelandic settlements with no apparent connection. Researchers have found net fragments from the early settlement period at sites separated by hundreds of miles of rugged coastline places with minimal contact due to Iceland's difficult terrain. The fragments show identical weaving patterns, identical mesh calculations, identical tar treatment methods. How did this knowledge spread so rapidly and so uniformly across an island where traveling between settlements required days of dangerous journey? Some scholars propose a pre-settlement testing phase. Perhaps Vikings explored Iceland decades before the official settlement date of 874, experimenting with fishing techniques and developing the kelp funnel net through trial and error before mass migration began. But no saga mentions such exploratory missions. No archaeological site shows evidence of pre-settlement Norse presence. The official narrative claims settlers arrived, encountered kelp forests for the first time, and within years had perfected a sophisticated netting system. The timeline feels compressed, the innovation too sudden. The barrel-weighted purse seine raises different questions. The technique required remarkable underwater work divers closing net drawstrings in frigid North Atlantic waters. Modern freedivers, with training and equipment, struggle to work effectively in water below 10 degrees Celsius. North Sea waters, where purse seining occurred, typically measure 4 to 8 degrees. How did Viking-era fishermen perform complex tasks underwater in such conditions? Historical sources mention the divers casually, as if underwater net manipulation was routine, unremarkable work. A single reference in the Heimskringla saga describes a diver named Erika, who could hold breath enough for 3 stone throws, roughly 3 minutes while working at depths where the water pressed like Thor's hand. 3 minutes of useful work underwater in near-freezing temperatures represents extraordinary physiological capability. Modern research on cold water adaptation shows that repeated exposure can increase tolerance, that some populations develop genetic advantages for cold water diving. The Sama Bajau peoples of Southeast Asia have enlarged spleens that help them dive longer. Did Viking fishermen develop similar adaptations, or did they possess training methods, breathing techniques, or preparation rituals that we have lost? The sources describe divers eating specific foods before diving, performing particular exercises, but never explain the actual methods. It is as though the saga writers assumed readers would already know that such knowledge was too common to require documentation. The bone hook long lines present the most mathematical mystery. Modern analysis of recovered Viking fishing hooks shows they were not carved randomly. The barb angles, the hook gaps, the overall proportions follow precise ratios. A study published in 2019 examined 47 bone hooks from various Viking sites and found that 93% adhered to a specific proportion. The distance from point to shank measured exactly 1.6 times the hook gap width. This ratio, close to the golden ratio, creates hooks with optimal holding power, preventing fish from escaping, while allowing easier removal of caught fish. How did Viking craftsmen discover this proportion? The mathematics required to calculate optimal hook geometry are sophisticated. Did they work it out through systematic experimentation, carving hundreds of hooks with different ratios and testing their effectiveness? Or did they inherit the knowledge from earlier peoples? Some Roman fishing hooks show similar proportions, suggesting ancient Mediterranean fishermen knew these principles. But no evidence connects Roman fishing knowledge to Viking Scandinavia, the most unsettling possibility. Perhaps they discovered it accidentally, through aesthetic preference or cultural tradition, creating perfect hooks without understanding why they worked. The hooks themselves remain, silent testimony to knowledge that might have been brilliant engineering or fortunate coincidence. The long-line buoy system adds another layer of mystery. Viking fishermen marked their line positions using sealskin floats, but they also needed to relocate these markers in open ocean, often in fog or darkness. Several saga references mention fishermen finding their lines by the stars or by the wave reading, but never explain these navigation methods. Modern sailors use sophisticated instruments, GPS, radar, depth sounders. Viking fishermen had none of this, yet routinely returned to precise locations in featureless ocean. They must have developed environmental reading skills of extraordinary subtlety. Wave patterns indicating underwater topography, bird behavior revealing fish schools, watercolor changes showing current boundaries. We know they did it. We simply do not know how. The kelp smoking process guards its own secrets. Modern attempts to recreate Viking fish preservation using kelp smoke have produced mixed results. Some batches achieve the described flavor and preservation qualities. Others fail completely, the fish rotting within weeks despite following what seem like identical procedures. Researchers have identified multiple kelp species in Viking-era sites, suggesting specific varieties mattered. They have found evidence of kelp harvested at particular tide stages, dried for specific durations, burned at controlled temperatures. But the exact combinations remain elusive. A food scientist working on recreation attempts described the process as alchemical, dozens of variables interacting in ways that ancient fishermen somehow mastered without thermometers, without written recipes, without scientific understanding of bacterial growth and chemical preservation. What we call the golden age of Viking fishing may have been something stranger than technological achievement. It may have been a moment when empirical knowledge built through countless generations of observation reached a peak that we have not recovered despite our scientific advantages. These fishermen could not explain why their methods worked, yet their methods worked perfectly. They carved hooks to mathematical ratios without knowing mathematics. They adapted to environments with speed that suggests knowledge transmission systems we do not understand. They performed physical feats in conditions that should have been impossible. The saga literature preserves fragments of this lost competence. Fishing heroes receive kennings, poetic names that hint at their skills. Wave reader, deep knower, tide whisperer, ice seer. These are not mere poetic flourishes. They are descriptions of actual capabilities that distinguished master fishermen from ordinary ones, and almost none of these capabilities are explained in sufficient detail to recreate them. We have their tools, their boats, their nets. What we lack is the human knowledge that made those tools effective. The environmental literacy, the accumulated wisdom, the practiced skills that turned simple equipment into instruments of survival and prosperity. The slow collapse of Viking fishing techniques began not with sudden catastrophe, but with gradual erosion from multiple directions. Christianity arrived in Scandinavia throughout the 10th and 11th centuries, bringing new spiritual frameworks that viewed ancient practices with suspicion. Night fire fishing suffered first. Priests declared it dangerously pagan. Invoking fire on water mimicked the realm of Loki, god of chaos. When King Olaf Tryggvason converted Norway to Christianity by force around the year 1000, he specifically banned fire fishing in his territories. Communities faced impossible choices: practice techniques that fed their families or obey religious authorities who controlled access to churches, marriages, and burials. Most chose obedience, and within a generation, the specialized knowledge of fire fishing began disappearing. Tidal weirs faced similar religious opposition, though for different reasons. Many weirs had been built with offerings to Njörður and Ran, sea deities who Vikings believed controlled fish abundance. Priests ordered these ancient installations destroyed as pagan altars. The magnificent weir at Vik, which had fed communities for 2 centuries, was dismantled in 1017 on orders from Bishop Sigurd. The stones were instead used to build a church foundation. Without the weirs, coastal communities lost their most reliable food source, forcing dangerous winter boat expeditions that previously had not been necessary. But religious change alone did not destroy Norse fishing dominance. A more profound challenge emerged from German territories, the Hanseatic League. These German merchant confederations approached fishing not as traditional craft but as large-scale commercial enterprise. They introduced new boat designs, larger vessels with deeper holds that could stay at sea for weeks. They brought new net technologies, hemp nets stronger than sinew, with wider spreads that could harvest more efficiently than kelp funnel nets. Most importantly, they brought capital and organization. Where Norse fishing remained largely family-based individual boats, small crews, techniques passed father to son, Hanseatic operations employed dozens of workers, owned fleets of vessels, and could process catches on unprecedented scales. The competition struck first at commercial techniques. Barrel-weighted purse seines, which had created fishing fortunes in Norway, could not match the efficiency of Hanseatic drag nets, pulled by multiple large boats. These drag nets swept entire sections of seafloor, harvesting not just herring but every fish in their path. The method was less selective, more destructive to marine habitats, but undeniably more productive in the short term. Norwegian fishing families, who had dominated herring runs for generations, found themselves unable to compete. By the year 1087, the last major Norwegian purse seine operation in Bergen had been abandoned. The elaborate coordination skills, the techniques for weighting and deploying nets, the knowledge of herring behavior, all became obsolete within a single lifetime. Bone hook long lines faced similar displacement. Hanseatic operations introduced iron hooks produced by German smiths, cheaper, more durable, and available in larger quantities than individually carved bone hooks. They used hemp lines stronger than walrus hide. Their larger boats could set longer lines, fish deeper waters, and stay at sea despite weather that would force Norse boats to harbour. The economic mathematics became brutal. A Norse long-line crew of 6 men might harvest 300 fish in a day. A Hanseatic operation with a larger boat and better equipment could harvest 1,000 with the same labour. Families who had built wealth through long-line fishing found their catches worth less, and their methods suddenly backward. Even techniques that survived religious opposition faced environmental challenges. The medieval warm period, lasting from roughly 950 to 1250, altered North Atlantic conditions. Water temperatures rose by 1 to 2 degrees, seeming trivial but profoundly affecting fish migration patterns. Cod populations shifted northward, moving away from traditional fishing grounds. Stone-weighted deep-line techniques, refined over generations to exploit specific fjord depths and seasonal patterns, suddenly proved less effective. Tidal patterns also shifted with climate change, subtly altering the effectiveness of the remaining tidal weirs. Structures built to exploit specific tide heights and timing found themselves increasingly misaligned with actual conditions. Rather than invest in fish additions, rebuilding these massive stone installations for new patterns, communities simply abandoned them. The skills of weir construction, knowing which stones to place where, how to angle walls to channel fish most effectively, how to maintain the structures through winter storms, disappeared as the last master builders died without apprentices to teach. Ice spear gaffing disappeared for the simplest reason: less ice. Warmer winters meant fjords froze less reliably. The technique that had sustained communities during frozen months became useless when ice no longer formed thick enough to support a person's weight. By the mid-1200s, winter ice fishing had become rare, practiced only in the coldest northern regions. Young people never learned the techniques where to drill holes for best results, how to recognize fish movements under ice, the specific jabbing motion that hooked fish without letting them escape. Greenland represented the last refuge of old knowledge. Isolated from European markets and Hanseatic competition, struggling with increasingly harsh conditions as the medieval warm period ended, Greenlandic Norse clung to traditional techniques. They maintained kelp funnel nets, practiced ice gaffing when conditions allowed, preserved fish with kelp smoke methods. But even there, the techniques slowly faded. Without contact with other Norse communities, without competition to drive refinement, the methods ossified. When the Greenland Norse colonies finally disappeared around the year 1500, the last settlers either dying, assimilating with Inuit peoples, or abandoning the settlements, they took the final living knowledge of Viking fishing techniques with them. By the year 1200, the transformation was complete. The fishing methods that had sustained Norse civilization for 4 centuries had been replaced by commercial operations that prioritized quantity over sustainability, short-term profit over traditional prize, knowledge, standardized techniques over regional adaptation. What had been lost was not just technical methods, but entire knowledge systems. Environmental understanding built over generations, social structures organized around fishing seasons, cultural practices that gave meaning to the relationship between humans and the sea. But here is what the historical record obscures. The transition from Norse to Hanseatic dominance happened with suspicious speed in some regions, glacial slowness in others. Bergen, Norway's fishing capital, converted to Hanseatic methods within 2 generations. Yet isolated fjord communities in western Norway continued traditional techniques into the 1300s. What determined which communities abandoned old ways and which preserved them? The standard explanation focuses on economic pressure and religious conversion, but the pattern does not align cleanly with either factor. Some communities that converted early to Christianity maintained traditional fishing methods for another century. Others that resisted Christian conversion abandoned Norse techniques rapidly when Hanseatic traders arrived. A few communities that had full access to Hanseatic technology deliberately rejected it, continuing with stone-weighted deep lines and kelp nets, despite knowing about supposedly superior alternatives. The Vestfjorda region of Iceland provides the clearest example. German merchants established a trading post there in 1138, bringing iron hooks, hemp nets, and large boats. Yet local fishermen continued carving bone hooks for another 70 years. A letter from a German merchant in 1159, preserved in the Hamburg archives, complains about Icelandic fishermen who refuse our good iron for their bone superstitions. Another document from 1173 mentions Icelandic fishers claiming that bone hooks called the fish in ways iron could not. These references suggest Norse fishermen believed their traditional equipment possessed qualities beyond mere functionality, perhaps spiritual significance, perhaps empirical effectiveness that they could observe but not explain to outsiders who dismissed their methods as primitive. The religious suppression of fire fishing also followed strange patterns. King Olaf Tryggvason banned it around 1000, yet Norwegian church records from 1047 mention priests complaining about fire heresy continuing in coastal parishes. For nearly 50 years after the official ban, communities practiced fire fishing despite clerical opposition. Some scholars interpret this as simple defiance, coastal peoples ignoring distant authority. But another possibility deserves consideration. Perhaps fire fishing was so effective, so crucial to winter survival, that communities risked spiritual consequences rather than abandon it. The technique must have worked extraordinarily well to justify that risk. When fire fishing finally disappeared, it vanished almost completely within a single generation. The technique that had survived 50 years of religious prohibition suddenly left the historical and archaeological record around 1060. What changed? Some historians point to increasingly effective church authority, bishops gaining enough local power to enforce bans they previously could only decree. But this explanation feels incomplete. Other pagan practices worship at sacred groves. Offerings to sea spirits persisted much longer in the historical record, some continuing into the 1200s. Why did fire fishing disappear so thoroughly when other pagan customs proved more resilient? Perhaps fire fishing required knowledge transmission that Christianity disrupted not through direct prohibition but through changing social structures. Night fire fishing was dangerous work, likely performed by specialists who trained apprentices over years. If these specialists occupied ritual roles in pagan communities, combining practical fishing skill with spiritual authority, their position would have been specifically targeted by Christian conversion. When these knowledge keepers lost their social position, their students, their reason to maintain the tradition, the technique could have died with them, regardless of whether others wanted to preserve it. The environmental changes compound these mysteries. The medieval warm period shifted fish populations, but it shifted them inconsistently. Cod moved north, yet herring populations in some areas actually increased. Some traditional fishing grounds became less productive, while others, previously marginal, improved dramatically. Norse fishermen, whose expertise lay in reading specific environments, would have struggled to adapt their place-based knowledge to changing conditions. But Hanseatic operations, with their standardized techniques and mobile fleets, could simply move to wherever fish were abundant. This creates a cruel irony. The very expertise that made Norse fishermen masters of northern seas, their intimate knowledge of specific locations, their techniques refined for particular environments, became a liability when those environments changed. Their strength was also their vulnerability. Hanseatic fishers, with less environmental knowledge but more flexible systems, could adapt more easily to shifting conditions. The superior local expertise of Norse fishermen, accumulated over centuries, suddenly mattered less than the industrial flexibility of their competitors. Yet some communities did adapt. The archaeological record shows Norse fishing settlements continuing in northern Norway and Iceland through the 1200s and beyond, even as southern regions transitioned to Hanseatic methods. These survivors must have modified their techniques, adapted their knowledge to new conditions. But we have almost no documentation of how they did this. The knowledge transmission was oral, practical, never written. When these communities eventually disappeared or fully integrated into broader commercial fishing networks, their adaptation strategies vanished with them. The Greenland colonies present the final mystery. Norse Greenlanders faced the harshest fishing conditions in the North Atlantic. As the medieval warm period ended and the Little Ice Age began in the 1300s, their environment became increasingly hostile, yet they maintained settlements until approximately 1,500, nearly 500 years after arriving. They must have possessed extraordinary fishing knowledge to survive that long in deteriorating conditions. Archaeological excavations of Greenland Norse sites reveal continued fishing activity through the 1400s. Fish bones, hooks, net weights. But the final decades leave almost no record. The settlements simply stop, leaving no explanation for why people who had survived for centuries suddenly disappeared. Some evidence suggests the last Greenlanders did not die but left, either returning to Iceland or assimilating with Inuit populations. If they assimilated, they would have abandoned Norse fishing techniques entirely, adopting Inuit methods better suited to Arctic conditions. This means the very last people who possessed complete knowledge of Viking fishing techniques might have deliberately chosen to forget it, to replace it with alternative knowledge systems that offered better chances of survival. The ultimate irony: the final guardians of ancient Norse fishing wisdom might have been the ones who consciously let it die. For 7 centuries, the 7 fishing techniques existed only as ghosts. Old stone weirs remained visible at extreme low tides, their purpose forgotten by coastal residents who wondered at their origins. Icelandic place names preserve memory: Firewater Bay, the Hook Grounds, Ice Gap Cove, though locals no longer remembered why these places bore such names. A few cryptic references appeared in Norse sagas, mentions of fishing heroes and techniques that scholars dismissed as poetic exaggeration. The knowledge seemed irretrievably lost. The first rediscovery came by accident. In October 1923, Norwegian archaeologist Anders Hagen explored a collapsed ice cave near the village of Rjukan. Inside the frozen debris, he found preserved fishing equipment. Stone weights carved with securing grooves, coiled walrus hide line, and most remarkably, complete sections of bone hook long lines with hooks still attached at precise intervals. Carbon dating eventually placed these artifacts around 1000 after Christ. Hagen's published description mentioned sophisticated weight distribution systems and hook spacing that suggested mathematical precision, challenging assumptions about Viking fishing as crude and primitive. More discoveries followed throughout the 20th century. Marine archaeologists mapping Norwegian fjord bottoms found stone anchor installations that initially puzzled them too large for boat anchors, arranged in patterns that made no nautical sense. Eventually, researchers realized they were examining weir foundations, massive communal structures that had sustained entire settlements. The weir at Vik, destroyed in 1017, was rediscovered in 1968. Underwater photography revealed its full scale, 212 feet of carefully fitted stones, positioned to exploit tidal currents with engineering sophistication that impressed modern marine biologists. The cultural importance of these discoveries emerged slowly. In 1967, anthropologists working in Greenland recorded the last elder who remembered stories about ice spear gaffing, told to him by his grandmother, who claimed her ancestors practiced it. Carl Johansson, then 83 years old, died 3 months later, taking the final oral tradition with him. His death prompted urgent documentation efforts. Museums began systematically collecting fishing-related artifacts, recording place names associated with fishing, and interviewing elderly fishermen before their knowledge disappeared entirely. Experimental archaeology brought the techniques back to life. In 1994, a team of Norwegian researchers attempted to recreate night fire fishing based on saga descriptions and artifact evidence. They built a historically accurate boat, constructed an iron fire basket, and sailed into a fjord at midnight. The result shocked them. Within 20 minutes, cod and mackerel swarmed to the surface around their firelight. They harvested 87 fish in 2 hours using only simple nets and spears, demonstrating that the technique worked exactly as ancient sources described. The experiment revealed something more important. These were not desperate survival methods, but sophisticated technologies refined through generations of observation. Modern commercial interest emerged unexpectedly. In 2015, a small Icelandic fishing cooperative called Vestfirðir began experimenting with traditional kelp smoke preservation, hoping to create a unique product for high-end restaurants. The first batches failed wrong kelp species, improper temperature control. But the fourth attempt succeeded. The resulting fish developed the distinctive flavor mentioned in medieval sources, rich, complex, utterly unlike modern smoking methods. Michelin-starred restaurants in Copenhagen and Reykjavik began serving Viking smoked cod, paying 3 times the price of conventional fish. Within 2 years, 5 Icelandic companies were producing kelp-smoked fish commercially, reviving a 1,000-year-old technique for purely economic reasons. Similar revivals occurred across Scandinavia, though on small scales. A group of history enthusiasts in western Norway rebuilt a tidal weir using medieval techniques, proving it could still trap fish effectively. They operated it for 3 years as an educational demonstration, catching enough fish to make it economically viable. The project revealed why the technique had worked so well. The weir required no fuel, minimal labor, and provided predictable harvests twice daily. It was, in modern terminology, completely sustainable. Environmental scientists became interested for different reasons. As industrial fishing depleted North Atlantic fish stocks, researchers began studying traditional methods to understand how Norse peoples had fished the same waters for centuries without collapse. They discovered that techniques like kelp funnel nets and stone-weighted deep lines were inherently selective, catching mature fish while allowing juveniles to escape, maintaining population health. The bone hook long line, when properly deployed, had far less bycatch than modern trawling methods. These primitive techniques embodied sustainable fishing principles that modern industrial methods violated. The most poignant revival occurred in 2023. A Norwegian fisherman named Erik Henriksen, fishing near Trondheim, began using a recreated stone-weighted deep line in his local fjord. He had learned the technique from his grandfather, who had learned it from his grandfather, maintaining an unbroken line of knowledge through 4 generations. Erik discovered the same rocky shelf where his ancestors had fished 1,000 years earlier. On his first attempt, he pulled up a 30-pound cod from exactly where tradition said cod would gather. He posted a video online that went viral. A modern fisherman using Stone Age technology in the exact spot his Viking ancestors had fished, proving that what worked then still worked now. These techniques will never return as mainstream fishing methods. Industrial operations are too efficient, markets too large, demand too great. But their rediscovery offers something more valuable than commercial revival. They demonstrate that traditional knowledge, often dismissed as superstition or primitiveness, frequently contains sophisticated environmental understanding developed through centuries of observation. They remind us that newer is not always better, that sustainable practices often look like limitations to industrial thinking. Most importantly, they prove that knowledge, even when seemingly lost, can be recovered not as museum curiosities, but as living practices still relevant to modern challenges. But here is what should trouble us about these rediscoveries. Every successful revival required extensive trial and error, multiple failed attempts, consultation with experts across disciplines. The 1994 fire fishing experiment succeeded, but only after researchers studied fish behavior, tested different fire intensities, and adjusted boat positioning through dozens of trials. The kelp smoking revival took 4 attempts and required a food scientist analyzing chemical compounds in different kelp species. These were educated professionals with access to laboratories, historical records, and funding, yet they struggled to recreate what Viking fishermen apparently did routinely. This suggests the recovered techniques represent simplified versions of more complex originals. We have the basic principles: fire attracts fish, kelp smoke preserves them, but lack the refinements that made them truly effective. When Erik Henriksen used his stone-weighted deep line successfully, he was following knowledge passed through his family for generations. His success was not just about equipment, but about inherited understanding of that specific fjord, that particular rocky shelf, the seasonal patterns of cod movement in those waters. He possessed context that pure archaeological recreation cannot capture. The experimental archaeology of 1994 revealed this gap inadvertently. The researchers harvested 87 fish in 2 hours, an impressive catch by modern recreational standards. But saga accounts describe single boats bringing in 500 fish during successful fire fishing nights. Either the sagas exaggerated by a factor of 6, or the modern experimenters were missing crucial techniques that made fire fishing truly productive. Perhaps they used the wrong fire intensity, or fished at the wrong tide phase, or lacked some subtle positioning skill that Viking fishermen learned through years of practice. The experiment proved the method worked, but it also revealed how much we have not recovered. The commercial kelp smoking operations face ongoing challenges that suggest missing knowledge. The Vestfirðir cooperative produces excellent fish, but their success rate remains inconsistent. Some batches achieve the distinctive Viking flavor, others do not, despite following identical procedures. They have identified the correct kelp species and approximate smoking temperatures, but clearly other variables matter, perhaps kelp harvesting season, perhaps fish fat content, perhaps humidity during smoking. Viking fishermen somehow controlled these variables without modern instruments, passing knowledge that allowed consistent results. That knowledge remains elusive, despite years of scientific investigation. The rebuilt tidal weir in western Norway worked, but not as well as its ancient predecessors. Modern engineers, using archaeological measurements and historical descriptions, created a structure that trapped fish effectively. Yet their harvests averaged 30% less than calculations based on medieval records suggested the original weirs produced. Something about the stone placement, the angle of the walls, or the timing of harvest made ancient weirs more effective. The difference might seem minor, but over years of operation, 30% less catch meant the difference between prosperity and marginal survival for medieval communities. They had refined these structures to incredible efficiency through generations of adjustment. We have approximations. These gaps point toward an uncomfortable reality. Industrial civilization, despite technological advantages, has lost practical environmental knowledge that pre-modern peoples possessed. We can sequence fish DNA, model ocean currents with supercomputers, and track individual fish with satellite tags. But we cannot reliably recreate a 1,000-year-old smoking technique. Our knowledge is broader, more abstract, more scientifically grounded. Theirs was deeper, more specific, more practically effective in particular contexts. Both types of knowledge have value, but they are not interchangeable. The viral video of Erik Henriksen using his stone-weighted deep line sparked unexpected controversy. Environmental activists celebrated it as evidence that traditional methods could replace destructive industrial fishing. Commercial fishing interests dismissed it as nostalgic fantasy, arguing that such techniques could never feed modern populations. Both interpretations missed the deeper point. Erik was not trying to replace industrial fishing or prove traditional methods superior. He was maintaining a connection to ancestral knowledge, keeping alive a way of understanding the ocean that his family had preserved when everyone else forgot. His video's popularity revealed hunger for this type of connection. Millions of people watched a Norwegian fisherman pull up a single cod using ancient methods, finding something compelling in that simple act. Perhaps they recognized that what was being demonstrated was not just a fishing technique, but a relationship with the natural world, patient, respectful, sustainable, that modern life has largely abandoned. The stone-weighted line was not more efficient than modern gear, but it embodied a different way of being in the world, one that many people sense we have lost. The question that haunts these revival efforts is simple. What else did they know that we have not yet rediscovered? The 7 techniques we have recovered represent only what survived in archaeology, saga references, and fragmentary family traditions. How many other innovations disappeared without leaving traces? The stone weights and bone hooks endured because they were durable. But what about techniques based purely on skill, observation, and timing methods that left no physical evidence? How many ways of reading waves, interpreting bird behavior, predicting fish movements vanished completely when the last practitioners died? One tantalizing hint appears in a Danish manuscript from 1247, a monk's account of visiting coastal villages. He describes fishermen who could taste the sea and know where fish gathered. The phrase appears once, never explained, never mentioned in other sources. Was this metaphor, observation of real behavior, or reference to an actual technique, perhaps tasting water to detect plankton blooms that attracted fish? We will never know. The knowledge, if it existed, left only that single cryptic reference. This is the true legacy of Viking fishing techniques. Not the handful of methods we have partially recovered, but the vast knowledge system we glimpse only in fragments. They were masters of their environment in ways we can barely imagine, reading complexity we need instruments to detect. Their knowledge sustained civilization in one of Earth's harshest climates for centuries. Most of that knowledge is gone. What remains whispers of human capability we have forgotten we once possessed, environmental literacy we no longer cultivate, patience we no longer practice. The stone-weighted lines and kelp-smoked fish that survive are not just historical curiosities. They are messages from ancestors reminding us that wisdom takes many forms, that newer is not always better, and that the sea still has lessons to teach those willing to listen as carefully as Vikings once did.